And let's focus on those who facilitated and legitimized this great crime. There are no excuses. There is nowhere to hide. From the very beginning, it was clear that a crime of historic proportions was going to be committed by the state of Israel. Back in October, I wrote a Guardian column, and it was headlined, "Israel is clear about its intentions in Gaza. World leaders cannot plead ignorance of what is coming." I wrote that column for a reason. It was obvious that a crime on an unimaginable scale was being committed, and that as the brutal reality became widely accepted and undeniable, those who legitimised and cheered on this abomination would plead ignorance and indeed offer regret. I wrote this article as a marker to clarify that it was abundantly clear at the time what the Israeli state was unleashing, and that there was no excuse for not knowing what they were doing. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. From the very start, statements of murderous intent making it clear that Israel was committed to mass indiscriminate slaughter and destruction were made by government ministers in Israel, by politicians, by generals, by army officers, by soldiers, by journalists, by entire media outlets, by public figures. We could go on in an orgy of genocidal mania. There are enough of these statements to fill an entire book or indeed several volumes, but suffice it to say that rarely in history has a state so openly declared over and over and over again in the most grotesque, depraved and inhuman language that it intended to commit terrible war crimes and crimes against humanity as it did them, often in overtly genocidal terms. Such statements led the Israeli-American Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Raz Sigal, who I interviewed myself, to declare just 9 days after 7th of October, "We're seeing the combination of genocidal acts with special intent. This is indeed a textbook case of genocide. No excuses, nowhere to hide." When Yoav Gallant declared a complete siege with no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel on the grounds, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly, why was his word not taken literally? Do people think that was just hyperbole? Maybe they thought he was having a joke. Did our politicians and commentators believe that when Gallant ordered his officers or told them that he had lifted all restrictions and separately all restraints on them, that he wasn't to be taken literally? Really? No excuses. Nowhere to hide. Listen, for example, to Major General Ghassan Alian, charged with Israel's military occupations and its operations in the occupied territories, declaring on the 9th of October, Hamas became ISIS, and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade in Gaza. No electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell. You will get hell. I ask you, what room is there for subtlety? And I'll tell you, there is none. No excuses, nowhere to hide. Those who legitimised and facilitated and cheered this horror on knew from the start that a military superpower was carpet bombing a tiny strip of land no bigger than East London, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, with explosives equivalent to several Hiroshima bombs. No excuses, nowhere to hide. They knew that most civilian infrastructure was being severely damaged and destroyed. Homes, schools, hospitals, mosques, churches, ancient landmarks. So much so that Gaza now looks a different colour and texture when looked at from space. No excuses, nowhere to hide. They knew that tens of thousands of Palestinians were being buried alive under the rubble of their own homes. Some killed immediately, others, including thousands of children, slowly cooked alive, slowly suffocated alive, or slowly cooked and suffocated alive, sometimes spending hours suffering the most agonising deaths imaginable while listening to the screams of their dying loved ones. No excuses, nowhere to hide. The complicit knew that Israel was overseeing the biggest slaughter of aid workers and journalists ever recorded in such a short space of time in any conflict in human history. No excuses, nowhere to hide. They knew that the medical system was being systematically destroyed by the Israeli state, its hospitals razed to the ground, its doctors and nurses and patients slaughtered so that maimed babies had their limbs amputated without anaesthetic, so that pregnant women had their newborns delivered by caesarean without anaesthetic. No excuses, nowhere to hide. And as the ICC statement makes clear, the complicit knew Israel had deliberately and systematically blocked the very basic means of survival: food, water, energy, medicine, imposing mass death on a civilian population, resulting in the biggest drop in the nutritional status of a population ever recorded. No excuses, nowhere to hide. We all we all had front row seats to some of the worst crimes committed in the 21st century as they were live streamed on a daily basis. The first live stream genocide in history, as it was called, for a reason. Few horrors in history have so much overwhelming documented evidence. And all that time, throughout, the Israeli state repeatedly promised an atrocity of biblical proportions, which I say literally, because in the case of Netanyahu, he invokes the story of Amalek, in which God orders the Israelites to kill men and women, infants and nursing babies, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys, and my word, did they deliver to the letter. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. President Joe Biden promised ironclad support for Israel and offered a limitless supply of weapons, including 2,000-pound dumb bombs, which were repeatedly used to rip apart the bodies of innocent civilians, including so many children, not least in areas designated safe zones. No excuses, nowhere to hide. Our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in Britain was aware that Israel's leaders had promised this horrific bloodbath when he declared the state had an absolute right to defend itself, and we see that absolute right, as he defined it, played out on a daily basis ever since. While his Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, promised to keep selling Israel weapons no matter what, even though it was clear his own lawyers had told him that Israel was breaking international law. No excuses, nowhere to hide. And don't forget Keir Starmer. Don't forget him, the leader of the opposition, who at the very beginning declared Israel had the right to cut off water and energy, despite his later disgusting attempts to gaslight us into believing he had never supported this abominable war crime. One specifically condemned by the prosecutor, as he noted how water pipelines and electricity supplies were cut off in his statement. No excuses. Nowhere to hide. And as for our media, our brave, courageous media. Now, there were examples of brilliant reporting, and we should be very grateful for that. Although, should we? Because this was the bare minimum. But it was there. But overall, this is one of the greatest journalistic scandals in history. And my word, the bar for that. Why was coverage of Israel's murderous onslaught not framed around the public statements of Israel's leaders? Not only did this not happen, even when they explicitly made clear their motives over and over again, many of these blood-curdling promises were barely even mentioned in Western coverage, despite proving the best and most accurate roadmap to the entirely predictable horrors which unfolded. Entire crimes were ignored and whitewashed. The lies of Israeli leaders were deferred to. They were allowed to muddy the waters. Palestinian voices were marginalised and ignored and defamed over and over and over again. The famine, which we're now discussing, how much coverage was there of the intentional attempt by the Israeli state to manufacture that famine? No excuses and nowhere to hide. It is clear what happened here. Those who are responsible for legitimizing and facilitating this grotesque crime, which will be remembered throughout the ages, they thought they'd get away with it because Palestinian life has been devalued to the point of having no value at all. Here, my friends, is a depraved story of where dehumanization at its most flagrant leaves us. Here too is a legacy of our failure to hold to account those responsible for previous catastrophes, not least those who drowned Iraq in blood and chaos, who walk from crime scene to crime scene splattered with more blood and get away with it. They believed, understandably, those therefore who cheered this atrocity on, that they can get away with anything. And they clearly saw Israel's own impunity as a form of collective insurance which would protect them as well. Well, we cannot let them get away with it. Our politicians and media outlets made this possible. They gave Israel the weapons and the cover to commit some of the worst crimes of our age. We can't let them get away with it. This isn't vengeance. There's not some satisfaction of winning an argument. But because unless we hold them to account for what they've done, then the horrors we have seen are the foreshadow of much worse to come.